Now, let's talk about Jesus' sacrifice and what Jesus' sacrifice really did do. Okay? Skipping on down into verses 5 through 7. It says, "Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. Then I said, Here am I. It is written about me in the scroll, I have come to do your will, O God.'" Now, that all sounds pretty confusing, doesn't it? It's a quotation from the book of Psalm, chapter 40, verses 6 through 8. But one thing that we need to see is that this quotation in the Old Testament was a prophecy about Jesus Christ and about Jesus Christ being our sacrifice. Now, let's look at this a little bit. We're going to see a little bit about what the sacrifice of Jesus Christ did as far as to cover over this wrath of God. Notice that in the very first part of verse number 5, it says, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire." Now, sacrifices and offerings, those were things that were, like I said, it was mandated in the law, in the Old Testament. The Israelites were supposed to do this, and they were supposed to do it for specific things and specific times. They were supposed to do specific rituals with the animals and so on and so forth. So to say, well, wait a minute, God didn't desire it. If God didn't desire it, why did he put it in his law? Well, he had another reason. You see, it wasn't that it's like God is sitting up in heaven, and he's looking at the slaying of an animal, and he's saying, yeah, I like that. You know? Oh, take Fluffy over there and go kill Fluffy. Boy, that'll be a good one. So that's not the way God is, right? Okay. God didn't like any of that necessarily. But he wanted it to be done because he had a different reason for it. And the reason for it is this right here. If you continue to take a look at verse 5, it says, "But a body you prepare for me." Now, if you'd looked at in the Old Testament, and if you would look at that in regards to not prophetic about Jesus Christ, it'd be a little bit confusing, right? But if you look into it in regards to Jesus, it makes all the sense in the world, doesn't it? As you continue to take a look in verse number 7, he says, "Then I said, Here am I, it's written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, O God." So here is God the Father, and he has got an overarching plan for humanity. And that plan is, in order to cover over his wrath and bring people back to himself, he is going to go and he is going to make a substitution of the penalty that's there. Sin has a penalty. The penalty of sin is death. In order for us not to have eternal separation from God, Jesus Christ is going to come and he's going to be our substitute. You see, the sacrifices all throughout the Old Testament are showing there is going to be a sacrifice made. There's going to be a sacrifice made. The Old Testament sacrifice don't cover it. That's why people have to keep on going back and doing it over and over again. But it's a picture to say, here is Jesus. As I said before, John 3:16, right? "For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son." Here in verse 5, it says, "A body you have prepared for me." Here we have the Son of God coming and becoming his own creation. This is the body that God has prepared for the Messiah. And what does the Messiah do? Oh, the Messiah comes and he just lives his life and he does whatever he wants and he just, goes on his own thing, and then eventually he just stumbles into doing God's will, right? No. Matter of fact, there in verse number 7, he says, "I've come to do your will, O God." And what's the will of God? Well, Jesus in John chapter 6 said that he didn't come to do his own will, but to do the will of his Father in heaven. And here we see that will coming to its fullest extent. Jesus did the Father's will all throughout his life because he and the Father were one. And so the Father's will was his will. And so all the requirements of the law, Jesus did. All the uncomfortable things of life, Jesus did. But here we come down to Jesus and the purpose and the reason for his life. Taking that life and putting it on Calvary's cross. And Jesus, the night before he was arrested, or the night of his arrest, was in the garden praying. And he prayed, Lord, if this cup could pass from me, then let it pass. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Do you see how this cup, this ordeal that Jesus was about to undergo on the cross, and it was a horrific death. This cup that was placed in front of Jesus, whatever the reason of his recoiling away from it, he recognized and realized that it was the Father's will to do it. You know, when Jesus was on the cross, people mocked him and taunted him and said, if you're the cross, come down, or if you're the Christ, come down off the cross. And he could have done that. He could have done that in an instant. He could have called a legion of angels to take care of the situation. You know, in the Old Testament, one angel took care of the Assyrian army that was besieging Jerusalem. If one angel could have taken care of a whole army, just imagine what a legion of angels could have done. You know? I mean, Jesus could have taken care of all of that with just a one simple command, but he didn't do it. Why? Because he realized that he needed to be this sacrifice. And this was something that was long since prophesied, okay? Now, hold your place there in the book of Hebrews and go back to the book of John chapter 19 real quick. Book of John chapter 19. And let's take a look at one little detail about Jesus' crucifixion in John chapter 19. You remember I said that when John the Baptist came and announced that this was the Messiah, he said that this is the Lamb of God. Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. Well, what did he mean by the Lamb of God? Well, he meant that this was a sacrifice that needed to take place. Now, if you remember what we read there in verse 31, that this was the day of preparation. The next day was supposed to be a special Sabbath day. When Jesus was crucified, it was the start of Passover, and during the time of Passover, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread would have taken place after that. And part of the Feast of Passover was that the population in that day and time went and selected and had their Passover lambs slain and observed the Passover feast one night, and then the Passover lamb would have been slain and sacrificed in the temple the following day. And so Jesus observed the Lord's Supper in that last Passover meal with the disciples that night. And then as the priests were sacrificing the Passover lamb, Jesus was on the cross. You say, okay, well, what's so special about that? Book of 1 Corinthians, it says that Jesus is our Passover. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, you recall in the Old Testament that the sacrifice of Passover was instituted because the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt. God sent his destroying angel judging the Egyptians, and the Israelites were supposed to take the Passover lamb. They were supposed to do certain things to that Passover lamb, but one thing that they were supposed to do is take the blood of that and put it on the sides of the door and the doorpost, or the doorpost and the header. And when the angel saw the blood, he was going to pass over that house and it was going to be kept safe. Another thing that they were supposed to do with that lamb is that they were not supposed to break any of its bones. It's kind of an odd requirement, don't you think? I mean, you know, you think about certain things that they're supposed to do. They're supposed to take a year-old male lamb. Didn't need to have any defects. If it was a family that was too small to consume all of it, they were supposed to invite another family over so that they could all do it. They were supposed to roast it. They couldn't boil it. They had to roast it. They had to roast it whole. They had to eat all of it. Anything that was left over, they had to dispose of. It had to be done with bitter herbs. They couldn't have any leaven or yeast in their house. They had to have it with with leaven or unleavened bread, excuse me. So you see all of these little details, right? But here's this one detail in all of that, which is what we see in verse number 36. These things happened so that the Scriptures would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. Now here's Jesus on the cross. Jesus said, "It is finished." He dismissed his spirit. He was dead. The soldiers came, and because they wanted to speed the process up, the soldiers were going to break the criminal's legs so that death would be sped up and they could take the bodies off the cross. But when they came to Jesus, well, he's already dead. So there's no need to break his legs. So they took a spear and they thrust it into his side, which is a fulfillment of another prophecy. But do you see God's power in all of this? That here we have godless, unbelieving Roman soldiers, cruel, sadistic men that had no clue of what the prophecies even were, much less a care in the world to try to fulfill them. But here's God's power that thousands of years before said, not a bone is going to be broken on the Passover lamb. Here is the Passover lamb on the cross. Here is the sacrifice for the sins of the world. Do you see how that is the sacrifice? And just as the death angel passed over the Israelites' household, God's wrath passes over us when we take the blood of that lamb and by faith apply it to our hearts.